Hello everyone. I'm doing another fairy video today. I haven't done one now in about a month. I got a little tied up finishing up my last book, Pagan Portal Store. It won't be out for like another year because I just finished it, but that's what I've been up to. So I haven't made a video in a little while. But I wanted to get back to the list that I had been looking at of questions on social media that people had asked, topics that they wanted me to take a look at. So today I thought we would talk about fairy kings, which is one of the questions I was asked to look at. And I think the reason this came up as a question is that there does tend to be more of a focus on fairy queens when we're looking at sort of the popular material today and also even the historic material to a degree. The fairy queens are a little more high profile. People are often a little more familiar with them. There's certainly a lot more to be said about them. So kind of understandable that people would be curious about the fairy kings. And fair play, depending on what area we're looking at, material on the fairy kings can be a bit scarce. Particularly if we look to, say, Scotland. There's really not a lot of detailed information to be found that focuses on fairy kings. We do see references to them, so we know that they exist. We know that they're there. But as far as I know anyway, we don't have any named examples of fairy kings in Scotland. We just have references to the fairy king or a fairy king. So, for example, in the oldest version of the Ballad of Thomas the Rhymer, which is a prose story called Thomas of Ercildoune, we see Thomas being taken into the land of Faery by the Fairy Queen, who also has no name but is just referred to as the Queen of Faery. And as he's being brought into Faery and on this journey with the Queen, she does mention that she is married, that she has a king. We don't really see too much of the king himself in the story. He's sort of referenced as the reason that Thomas is not supposed to speak while he's in Faery in this oldest version of the story, because Thomas and the Fairy Queen have had an tryst. They've become lovers, and the Fairy Queen does not want the king finding this out. So she sort of compels Thomas to remain silent for the length of time that he is in Faery. So that's one example where we see the existence of a fairy king referenced. In the works of some of the 15th and 16th century Scottish writers who are talking about Nick Nevin, for another example, we also see references to the King of Faery. Literally just one-line references to the Queen of Faery traveling out with her king and her nymphs and elven knights. So again, not a ton of detail. We know that they're there, but we don't really know anything substantial about them. And that seems to be sort of what we have with the Scottish material. We do also have some brief references to the King of Faery in the Scottish witchcraft material. Isabel Gowdy, for example, one of the most famous of the Scottish witches, persecuted in the 17th century, if memory serves, does talk about how when she would be brought by the fairies to meet with the Queen of Faery, she also met with the king. She describes him as being a handsome fellow. So that's probably one of the more detailed descriptions we have of a King of Faery in the Scottish material. But again, not a ton of depth, no name given. That's sort of what we have for that particular reference. We can also look at some of the English material and the English ballad material as well. Again, not much in the way of names in some of this. We see more indirect, again, references to the King of Faery as an unnamed figure, but in these stories and in these poems and ballads, we do see more details of who they are as characters. There's one ballad called Alice Brand, where Alice Brand has this lover. Her lover kills her brother in a fight, on the battlefield in a fight. The two of them then flee and go to live in the Greenwood. The Greenwood is, of course, ruled by the fairies, and specifically this particular fairy king. And the king is very offended that these two humans are living in his forest and have the nerve to wear green, which is a fairy color. So he then sends one of his people out to try to get them to leave, and shenanigans ensue. But this is one of the more detailed descriptions we see of a fairy king. Again, unnamed, but we do see a little more of his character sort of outlined in this particular story. We can also see an example, of course, one of the most famous examples of a fairy king in English material anyway would be Shakespeare's Oberon. Everyone knows Oberon from Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare did actually not invent this character, kind of surprisingly, because some of Shakespeare's characters were made up sort of whole cloth, taken from source material, but then recreated. In this case, however, Shakespeare is not the one who created Oberon or the concept of him. He appeared earlier in a French work called Huon of Bordeaux. Now, mind you, the depictions of Oberon from one piece to the other are very, very different. Shakespeare's Oberon, of course, king of the fairies, married to the queen Titania, who in the course of the play, the two of them are disagreeing over the fate of a particular changeling child. And because of this disagreement, Titania has, to quote the play, forsworn his bed and his company. And because he is irked about this, and that she will not just give him this child, he has Puck, who's his sort of second in command in the story, put a love spell on her, which causes her to fall in love with a sort of base commoner mortal, who has also had his head replaced with that of a donkey. Good times. So that case is a very specific sort of Oberon. Also, clearly in the play was depicted by a human-sized person. And based on Titania and her relationship with Nick Bottom, they would appear both to have been human-sized in the story as well as in the play. In Huon of Bordeaux, Oberon is described as the size of a 3-year-old child, deformed but extremely beautiful, wearing a jeweled gown, very powerful spirit, powerful king of the fairies. This work was a 15th century piece, by the way. So this sort of reflects a very different understanding of who this particular fairy king would have been, clearly coming out of the French culture and then moving into the English. Interestingly, there are some scholars who feel that both the English and the French Oberon were probably originally based on the 12th century Germanic Alberic, who was a dwarf in the Norse Germanic mythology, but whose name means elf ruler, and was also, again, a powerful spirit, able to influence things, cause good or bad luck, that sort of thing. So the names seem to have some connection or relationship to each other, and so do the history of the spirits, these particular fairy kings. So there are some scholars who trace Alberic to Oberon as he appears in Huon of Bordeaux 300 years later, then to the appearance 100 years later of Oberon in the English Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. So it's sort of a little mini evolution of this particular fairy king. We also see different spirits named Oberon, or very similar names that are likely related or spelling errors of that same name in the grimoire material of the 15th through 17th centuries. These spirits are not always referred to as fairies, or specifically a fairy king. They are in some cases called an angel, spirit of a soldier, spirit of a child. So the understanding of this being in the grimoire material seems to have been very broad. Not uncommon for the grimoire material. They particularly seem to have a difficult time with the fairies and trying to figure out what they were and what context they were going to be put in for ceremonial magicians of those periods. But I did want to mention that we do see this named spirit in that material as well. Sometimes depicted as a fairy king, other times not. So that is one of the more well-known English fairy kings. And of course, in the modern era, probably the most well-known fairy king precisely because of Shakespeare. When we look at the Irish material, we find a very different picture overall on the subject of fairy kings. The Irish are a lot more, what's the best way to put this, equal opportunity for their fairy monarchy. We do see quite an arrangement of queens, particularly in the southwest. There's a cluster in the Munster and Cork, specifically areas of various fairy queens, although we do also see them in other areas as well. So we have quite a few named fairy queens in Ireland, but we do also have named fairy kings, and these come to us less from mythology and more from folklore. But we do have, let's see, Don Farina, who was originally probably connected to a god of the dead. Probably, possibly. Irish mythology gets very convoluted, but is now in some places viewed as a king of the fairies. He rides out with his men of the Sidhe on horseback in certain places. We also have the Dagda, who definitely was originally a pagan god, is still a pagan god. But he is referred to in the mythology and then in later folklore as the king of all the Sidhe of Ireland, the king of all the fairy mounds of Ireland. And there are depictions in some stories, the Dream of Angus, for example, of him having authority over other kings of fairy in specific places. There's also a fairy king named Boabh Jerg. Red Boabh would be his name in English. Boabh may or may not be related to the word for crow, by the way. So red crow is another way you could read that. Hooded crow, specifically. Anyway, I digress. Boabh Jerg is actually a son of the Dagda, but he is also referred to in a lot of material as a king of the fairies, one of the fairy kings. So, we certainly have that reference. Of course, there is Finvara, who is one of the better known fairy kings, I think, in Ireland. I think I'm extremely familiar with him. I might be over assuming that other people are, but he's found in the sort of Sligo, Galway area towards the west coast. And Finvara, his name originally in the Old Irish was Finvar. It means, most likely, I should say, means like blonde hair, fair-headed. Sort of right there tells you a bit about what he looks like. He, again, is a son of the Dagda. He's said to be the youngest son of the Dagda, actually, in the source material. Fosterage of the House of Two Milk Pails, specifically, if you want to look up that reference, refers to him as the youngest son of the Dagda. He is very well known, very, very well known, as a king of the fairies in Ireland. He has quite a lot of exploits and, again, shenanigans that he gets into. One particular story, he steals someone's wife, takes her back into his fairy hill. The husband, in trying to get her back, ends up trying to dig into the fairy hill and eventually salts the earth there until Finvara releases his wife. He's pretty well known for his womanizing and his fondness for mortal women in the folklore. He does have a wife, the fairy queen Una. They have different fairy mounds in folklore, so you can make of that as you will. But he does have a wife. Finvar, he's also known for his fondness of horse racing. Horses in general are something that's associated with him. He, much like Don Freyna, is associated with the dead, potentially as a lord of the dead. The dead and the fairies, as I've discussed in a previous video, very complicated topic. So, you might want to review that one. I'm not going to get into it again here. But just touching on a few of the named Irish fairy kings here. There are, of course, others. I'm just highlighting some of them. What we have now when we look at all of this and the topic of fairy kings, we do see that while the fairy queens are more sort of high profile, more well known, certainly seem to exist in greater numbers and appear more often in literature and in folklore, the fairy kings are a presence and certainly do exist in the literature and folklore as well. Now, again, in Scotland, there is less substantial material about them, more just general references, usually in conjunction with a fairy queen in some way or another. Even in the Ballad of Alice Brand, the fairy queen doesn't directly appear while the fairy king does, but he does mention his fairy queen in that. Just a little FYI. So they do always tend to seem to appear one way or another connected to a fairy queen in the Scottish material. Again, at least as far as I'm aware. Now, when we look at the English material, it's a bit of a different picture. We do still see fairy queens, of course. Fairy queens are kind of inescapable. But we do also have more of a presence with fairy kings, more of a developed presence, and certainly a much stronger characterization. Specifically, as we discussed with Oberon, who is one of the more big name popular ones. And then when we move to Ireland, we see pretty much a very different picture from what we find in Scotland and England, where there's a lot more diversity. There's fairy queens, there's fairy kings. The folklore around the fairy kings is very well developed, very detailed. We have their actual names. A lot of them were definitely originally gods, some type or another. So very different to look at. I'm not going to get into the Welsh material here, although that certainly is worth discussing, only because I am not as familiar with the concept of fairy kings and fairy queens within the Welsh structure. I don't know for sure if all of the Welsh gods as we understand them today would be viewed as part of fairy in some sense. For what it is worth, when we look at fairy kings in a Welsh context, we definitely have Gwyn ap Nudd, who is sort of well known as a king of fairy and as Lord of the Dead. So, they definitely do have a fairy king in Wales. I just am not entirely confident speaking in depth on that material, because I'm not as clear about the wider fairy king and fairy queen concept over there. It's also good to keep in mind, just in general, in any discussion of fairy monarchy, that the system is not necessarily what we would understand the human monarchy system to be. They do, according to folklore and mythology, have kings and queens, but it's not this all-encompassing wide scale that I think sometimes we tend to assume based on the human world. These would be kings and queens of specific fairy hills, very specific locations and smaller areas, if you will. Not entire countries or, vast expanses of space. Think think smaller scale. Although still kings and queens in the context that they're in. So a little bit of food for thought there to end with. But that's a sort of a crash course in fairy kings, who they are across 3 different cultures anyway. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. And I will try to make another video fairly soon now that I am not neck deep in trying to get a book written. Have a great day.